Clementine's eyes snapped open quickly, the world around her hard to make out through the blurs. She could not pinpoint the nearby shapes, large and moving quickly as through panic. The sight frightened her, but it was only her vision cleared that she realized how close to danger she was. The threat didn't connect to her right away, nor did it sheer reality into the situation that settled her mind. What she saw was so immediately inconceivable that she almost rejected the idea outright. But like always, the shock dissolved once she realized that her life was at stake. She scrambled up from her sleeping position. Sarah was curled on herself towards this corner of the room, head ducked and body trembling almost violently. Despite that, Nick was still asleep, a bit away from them. Luke was on his hands and knees nearby, closing on her as if she screamed for him to stay. It was only Luke, but something much more horrible. Clementine's heart sank when she recognized the Walker version of her friend. The skin around his face still blue from the water he sunk into. His clothes hung out his skinny frame, some of his body already rotting away after death. All images of the proud, level-headed cabin group leader went up in flames, reduced to something inhuman. Luke could only be put down like a dog, and nothing could be done to help him. Luke had helped Clementine so much, been her support when she was in need of them, some hope had housed. It wasn't fair that she couldn't give him the same now. But really was Sarah in danger? There was no time to grieve at the moment. The overwhelmed, fresh with adrenaline, Clementine scrambled for her gun, moving to shoot. But Luke had gotten too close to Sarah, and from her position, she risked shooting the older girl too. "Sarah, use your gun! Shoot him!" she yelled. But Sarah was too paralyzed in fear by the instructions, let alone even move to get her weapon. But if they didn't do something soon... "Luke, what's wrong?" Sarah stammered, her eyes wide and terrified. "Please, leave me alone." "That's not Luke anymore," Nick suddenly cried out, awake and alert within milliseconds. He leaped onto his feet, giving a warm hand just to try and distract the walker. "Hey, over here! Come and get it, rotten bastard!" The creature lifted his head, glassy eyes trailing over what probably saw was a larger meal, giving a feral snarl. Luke crawled towards Nick, teeth snapping and fingers bent like claw-like, grotesque angles. Nick appeared to be bracing himself as he approached, fists tightened around the gun on his side. He backed up further from the fireplace and near the staircase that Arvo was tied to. The Russian teen was just rousing from his restless sleep, noticed the walker immediately. The color drained from his already paled face and leaned against the far back as he could, tugging on the ropes, keeping him pinned to the upstairs for support. He screamed, with his revs more wildly the Nick closer got to him. Get away! Please, do not let it get closer!" "Don't worry, kid. I'm luring him here, but I won't let him get you," Nick muttered, his eyes trained on the threat as the walker crept forward. "That's it, buddy. Come on. I'm right here. Just you and me, Luke." His voice trailed off before he choked out, "Like old times." He cast a glance at the girls, gaze focused and determined despite seeing his best friend reanimated in front of him. "Sarah, Clementine, somebody get ready to shoot the minute I say so." His voice was cool and collected. Sarah stood shocked with fright and muttering to herself, but Clementine readied her gun as she was told. Holding in her breath, the girl watched as Luke drew closer and closer to Nick. The grotesque noises getting louder, her fingers tightened around the base of the gun, brown eyes narrowing in concentration. The walker hissed and lunged forward, tackling Nick to the ground. The man's hands shot up right in front of his chest just to protect himself, but Luke only scraped and scratched him, shredding the material of his sweatshirt. Clementine aimed her gun and waited for the best shot. When Luke bent down his head, he'd be in perfect line for the shot. "Stop it! Stop, please!" Sarah begged her, tears forming in her eyes. "Why won't he stop, Clem?" "You know why, Sarah. They never stop," Clementine hissed. Why did the girl understand yet that Luke was now a little bit more wild than an animal? Didn't she give enough experience with them? Clementine had been very patient, but with the threat both of Nick's death was very prominent. She couldn't afford to be anything but pushy. "Then we have to shoot, Clem!" Sarah exclaimed, pointing her gun a bit lower than Luke's head. Without waiting for a response, she took the deep breath, squeezed her finger around the trigger like Troy and Clementine had taught her. Despite the shot being so close to Clementine's ear, She barely registered the noise and kept the eyes on Nick and Luke. The walker flinched and a bullet pierced in its back, but it looked relatively unshaken. The contrary, it just seemed to anger him more. With a roar, he pulled his weight onto Nick, jaws rapidly clicking in hunger. Nick grunted with effort, trying to fight off his walker fiend friend. His limbs flailed in defense, a terrified expression on his face, despite his heroic move. While Nick seemed to be weakening, Luke didn't have any human limitations anymore. The creature would just keep moving and biting until he either ate or was killed. "Now, shoot!" he called out. A pained gasp was cutting off his words. Without hesitation, without even remembering who she was shooting, Clementine fired, but the bullet hitting Luke straight at the back of the head. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was enough to make him sink down and lie still. Once he was down, it was clear that he wasn't going to get back up, if the pool of black blood leaking from his head was anything to go by. Luke's remains were slumped onto Nick, the man's breath heavy and labored as he tried to push the corpse off. His whole body trembled and his eyes were widened, his strength clearly depleted. He tried a few more times to get it off from under Luke, but eventually gave up his efforts. Sitting in silence, Clementine approached him, offering a hand. There was nothing to say to him, but at least not about Luke. What could she say honestly? "Are you okay? Sorry that your friend died. Want a hand to step over the corpse?" No. Anything now would be just merely noise to him. Mindless mutters that she honestly didn't have the energy to spare for. So she kept quiet, lips drawn from frown, as she tried to push the reality of what had just happened out of her mind now. For now she wanted Nick to take her goddamn hand. The man was very clear in shock. However, when he finally managed to notice her nearby, he merely dragged his gaze up to her, and a haunted expression etched onto his face and merely set into the deep blue eyes. There was something familiar about the image of fear and despair he wore. Churned Clementine's stomach to try and match the expression with those she had been with in the past, but she couldn't quite picture of it yet. Nick had just lost his best friend since childhood. She reasoned that it must be why he looked so drained. Clementine was faintly aware of Arvo and Sarah crying out hysterically for help, as well as AJ crying in his makeshift cradle, so she could barely hear any of them. All she could do now was focus on Nick's eyes and on how sunnily frightened he looked. Then again, he was now facing a world without Luke, as was she. Losing such a close friend wouldn't be easy to get over with. The loud yells in the room apparently alerted the others. One by one, the adults came rushing through the doorway from another part of the safe house. "What the fuck is going on?" Troy, of course, was the first to comment. His voice was irritated squawk. Clementine finally wrenched her gaze from Nick to shoot the one-armed man and glare, quite annoyed at herself. "What's all this?" Bonnie gasped next, holding up a hand to her mouth in disbelief. Clementine watched faces drain with color as they saw the horrible sights in the room. The recognizable dead walker was on the ground, bad enough, surely, but added the crying AJ, fearful Arvo, weeping Sarah, dazed Nick, and frazzled Clementine. It was all just a complete mess. "What the hell happened?" Mike echoed. Troy's questioned, not drawing the move yet. "Is that—" "Yeah, it's Luke," Nick murmured, flailing once more to try to push the weight off of him. With a growl of frustration, he hissed, "I got him away from the girls in time, thankfully. Guess he turned into a lurker overnight." Mike flashed Nick a sympathetic glance as he approached the scene, pushing Luke's corpse off of him as gently as he could. It was a respectful gesture, and the pained look on Mike's face gave Clementine a glimpse of just how popular Luke had been back at Howe's. "Here, man." Mike offered a hand now, and Nick took it this time. The taller man shrugged to his feet, but still breathing heavily. He looked ragged, the dark circles under his eyes a little bit more prompted, and his shirt ripped into bloody shreds. The cold was just too much for him. Just too much. His voice cracked as he set his gaze back on his best friend's corpse. "He attacked Sarah. We had to take him down." "Oh, Nick," Bonnie murmured, flashing a sympathetic look at him. "We understand. You did what you had to. I'm real sorry that happened. Luke he was a good man, kind as ever, determined and brave." "Yeah, he was," Nick agreed miserably, lowering his head further. "Deserves someone who didn't fall asleep when he swears he'll keep watch. Who would have done more for him at the end? Guy's there for me my entire life, And when he needs me, I let him down. His eyes closed, and he rubbed the back of his head and his neck uncomfortably. He fell into freezing water, Kenny argued, his first words said as he sensed coming back inside. There ain't no messing with that. You tried your best, though giving him a fire, trying to keep warm, it was all you could do. Kenny's right. Take it from someone who's been studying medical shit. Man, hypothermia is irreversible past certain point, Mike added, and paused for a moment when something clearly dawned on him. He turned to Arvo, who was still chained up and shaking like a baby deer. Speaking of freezing water, are your legs okay, kid? Arvo's expression twisted into sadness before melting back in fear. I can feel them, he mumbled. They're cold, though. I almost forgot you fell in, too, Mike replied apologetically. We're going to get you near a fire, all right? He approached the Russian cautiously, hands raised to show that he meant no harm. The teen's lips pursed. He almost straightened up and let Mike unchain him. However, some cruel reality must have settled in his mind, for quickly flashed a terrified look at Kenny's way, and he shook his head. No, I'm fine. It's not necessary. Damn right he's fine, Kenny sneered. You ain't getting off that post, no way in hell. His face twisted smugly into a dominant grin as he spoke. Clementine decided she absolutely hated that look on him. Mike flashed him a defiant look, anger blazing through his eyes. Are you frickin' serious, Kenny? He could just freeze like that, just like Luke. At least he'll be chained up, if he ends up turning, Troy pointed out with a shrug. That's inhumane, you bastards. Mike's lips then curled into a snarl. Then he moved to the stand in front of Arvo protectively. The kid doesn't deserve to go out like that, and I ain't going to let you do that. Kenny shoved his face forward at the younger man, a challenge to a burning gaze. You want to try me, Mike? Because I'm not really the one on frickin' mood for this shit right now. We just lost another of your own, and you're worried about that brat? He ain't a brat. Hell, he doesn't even need to be our prisoner anymore. We can let him go, Mike tried to reason. Think about, he brought us to the safe house. What is more use is he? Like hell, Kenny snorted. He'll just run and we'll be shit out of luck when he brings more of his rusky buddies back here to blow our faces off. Then we'll just get the kid warm. That's all it frickin' takes, Kenny. I'll get him warm, in a pool of his own blood, if he takes much as a step out of the line. Please stop! A strained yell echoed from the small room, voice belonging to the shaking girl in the corner. Sarah was almost in her hysterics, but the look in her eyes was more clear than ever. Please let Arvo by the fire. I don't want to see anyone else die. Please. Sarah, Nick began, but Sarah just fell to her knees and shook her head in protest, covering her face in her hands. Luke died, she whispered, trying to wipe her good eye as bet despite the glasses. And you're all fighting like it means nothing. Please stop it. Just let us say goodbye. Let us say goodbye. Her voice was cut off as she succumbed to sobs, curling herself onto the corner of the room. The outburst seemed to calm down with the raging males in the group. AJ could be heard crying once more in the background, prompting Kenny to give up the fight and pick up the child in a shushing voice. There, the older man hushed, surprising Clementine with his gentle sigh once more. After shooting a quick glare towards Mike, he snapped, Fine, put him by the fire, but what I want one of you to watch him. I'll make sure he stays put, Jane volunteered with a casual shrug. Kenny gave her a nod of approval, and she monotonically went on to undo Arvo's chains. The rest of the group seemed to agree and return where they have been, if only to let the last cabin folks say goodbye. It's getting late, Bonnie mentioned, making Clementine wonder just how long they had been asleep. Sun should be setting soon. We'll keep this fire going and open up some food, and you take care of them however you like, Nick. We'll be here if you need us. Nick nodded. Thanks. Me and Sarah will say some words outside, I guess, and Clem if she wants. The girl merely gave a nod in response. All right, Bonnie replied gently. And again, Luke doesn't deserve to go out like that, but it ain't no one's fault he did. Her eyes then flashed sympathetically from Luke's body to Nick, then over to Sarah, and with a shake of her head, she walked back outside with Mike. Kenny then bounced AJ gently in his arms, whispering to the child as he followed the other two out of earshot. Once everyone began to move, Troy almost automatically shifted towards the body, clasping his hand around his arm and beginning to drag it towards the door with a grunt of effort. And automatically in return, Nick stepped up and blocked his way, a hard look on his face. Didn't you hear, Bonnie? You're all going to get food going, and we're going to take care of Luke. The older man hissed, almost like a protective animal. So let him go now. Look, all I heard. But I think you're all frickin' idiots. I don't even know how to take care of your dead before. Troy then retorted with a roll of his eyes. But this ain't shit going to stink soon, and I ain't getting here and... Nick then gave the other man a warning shove and cutting off his words. I said to let him go. I'm not going to leave him here, so don't worry about that. I'll just don't want you doing anything to him. So shut the fuck up, Troy, and stop acting like you're high and mighty. Troy obviously didn't respond well to the physical aggression, his lips then curling back and the brows knitting together. Y'all think I was born yesterday? This sentimental shit is going to be getting you all killed one day. A dead lurker is going to attract more lurkers, and we'll be swarmed with them soon enough. All because you want to keep your boyfriend here a little longer. Get the frick over it. With a roar, Nick's fist flew into Troy's jaw, knocking the smaller man backwards a few feet. Troy rubbed the wound spot before splitting into something pink onto the floor, charging forward, giving a frustrated yell of his own. The one-armed man attempted to punch adversary, but Nick was able to dodge him and grabbed a hold of his arm. Subduing him only means that he had to attack with. Struggling, Troy seethed. Let go of me. That ain't fair, you son of a bitch. He then pulled out his arm, trying to back away out of the grip. However, yanking too hard made him flinch. He clearly was a bit of a strain, and much for the stump on the other limb. The wound may not be life-threatening anymore, but it probably still hurt like crazy. Clementine exchanged glance with Sarah, who was still in the corner of the room, before hesitantly calling, Nick, please calm down. He's not worth it. Ain't fair? Ain't fair? Nick echoed, teeth grinding together. He completely disregarded her words, or perhaps he didn't hear them. His eyes were wide and focused now, reflecting on both burning fury and pain. You know what ain't fair, Troy? We had to shoot Luke. He was like a goddamn brother to me, and we had to kill him. His voice cracked at the end of the words. Film unhushed the tears over his eyes, and the hand that held onto Troy now was trembling. He let go, still standing tall to protect Luke's corpse. There was a wall of determination and reckless loyalty that Clementine knew could penetrate. Troy then started towards Nick, his eyes equally widened as he backed up. His face, though, pale as if he had seen a ghost. His legs wobbled as he almost fell. He forced distance between them, unable to meet the other's gaze. Swallowing hard, the older man muttered in brief, Whatever, do what you frickin' want. I don't give two craps. Before turning around and striding outside as quickly as he could, Clementine hesitated for a moment, wondering if she could go after him and make sure that he was okay, but she opted it to the end. As much as she'd rather say goodbye to Luke, it wasn't like Troy would let her say anything anyway. Sarah finally came out of the corner that she had been stuck in, casting a fearful glance where Troy had left. Clementine assured her not to worry, as he seemed to be affected by Nick's words. Of course, the younger girl only knew why, and it couldn't be denied as he looked spooked. You think he'll come back? She asked, still nervously peeking around the corner where he left. Clementine shook her head. Honestly, it seemed like Troy would be staying away for quite a while, and she couldn't decide whether that was a relief to her or not. The room grew quiet. The crackles from the fire nearby only sound. Jane and Arvo occupied the other half of the living room, but they were far enough away and didn't seem to be paying any attention. So anyway, the space they occupied felt intimate enough for four of them. Sarah broke the silence, heaving a long sigh as her eyes locked onto what remained of Luke. I can't believe this was Luke, she whispered, another tear slipping down her cheek. He was alive when we got here, and now... Both Nick and Clementine joined her, almost in vigil, to inspect their fallen friend. A wilted walker's arm was still outstretched, and his mouth still hung open in his search for a meal. But he moved no more, his lifeless body staring off into nothingness as more dark liquid gushed from the bullet hole in the back of his head. Walkers were nothing new. The presence was almost normal in everyday life now, but the sights became even more horrible and twisted when a personal touch was added to them. When the walking dead became reanimated friends and family, the monsters were 10 times scarier. He must have passed in his sleep, Nick finally murmured, his voice like gravel. A hand traveled through his friend's glassy eyes, lowering his lids to give him a more peaceful expression. I guess it's good to know that he didn't suffer. I don't think he suffered either, Clementine agreed, and you And you put him down so he wouldn't have to go on as a walker. Nick's shoulders slumped. Yeah, I didn't do enough for him when he was still alive. That's not true, Sarah exclaimed, shaking her head. Nick, you did a lot for Luke. More than I did or anyone. She's right, Clementine agreed. If she had any chances of survival, if he did, it was because of you. Nick pursed his lips, considering the girl's words, but still looking quite miserable. I don't know, he began, unable to continue what he wanted to say just yet. With a long breath, the man seated himself next to Luke, curling his knees to his chest. It looked like a rather uncomfortable stance for him, such a lanky and tall person, but it truly did make him seem like he was small and probably felt. When we were kids, he tried again, his voice shaky murmur. I was always following him around. It was so hard to find one of us without the other. We always did some stupid things, but yeah, he always had my back. When my dad, when he left, Luke was there, offering what he could. He was just so damn giving. But even Luke needed help too at the end, Clementine pointed out quietly. And when he was on that ice, he admitted he was scared. He was human, just like the rest of us. Not someone to fully depend on because he had his own feelings. Yeah, he did needed help, Nick agreed. And I tried to save him. I really did. His words suddenly sounded like a little boy's pained pleas that didn't absolutely mean for it to happen. That he tried his best and he failed regardless. Clementine found herself kneeling next to Nick, placing a hand on his shoulder. I know, she whispered, pretending that she couldn't see the tears sipping from the man's cheeks out of respect. She definitely felt some same sadness, though. It was thick in the air, like toxic smoke. Once she took the sight of her fallen comrade again, in reality it hit her like Luke is not coming back. Once she knew that it was just how the world worked now, she wouldn't ever see Lee or her parents or anyone that died again. It still hurt, and as for someone like Luke, whom she'd grown close to in the past few weeks, to suddenly pass away, she wouldn't pretend it was easy. Loss would never be as anything she accepted it. It got easier to cope as more and more loved ones separated from their life, but it was never just something that she instantly got it through. And Luke, he led the group in a spectacular way from Carver's Trail, though through Howe's trainee once, and inevitably to be caught. The Walker herd, he had been such a big help for the others, and what did they do in return? They let him die. It was no one's fault. Clementine knew, but she couldn't help but feel guilty when she thought of what Luke's final thoughts were. He must have been freezing and wondered why no one around him gave him warmth. To die like that with nothing and no one to give him comfort in his last moments, it must have been horribly lonely. We'll bury him in the water, Nick murmured, breaking the silence. It's not the classiest, definitely less than he deserves, I guess, but it will do. Much better than having him rot. With a grunt, the man lifted his friend's corpse, carrying him gently through as he was merely asleep. The girls followed him somberly, watching as he left the house and placed Luke gingerly onto the icy ground. Three of them stared at him for quite a while, the sunset casting orange and yellow reflections onto the ice. Despite the sun showing itself for the first time in days, it didn't seem any warmer. Nick kept his eyes on Luke, seeming though through that he was hesitating to move. His hands hovered over the other man's prone form as he let out an audible gulp, his teeth gone on his lips. Eventually let out a long sigh and turned back towards his younger companions. This is it, then. Sarah frowned deeper, exchanging glance with Clementine. We have to say goodbye to Luke. Clementine nodded wordlessly, not having anything to weigh in. Nick's gaze gently swept around the white world, fixing a small hole in the ice nearby. It seemed like a perfect burial spot, big enough to fit Luke's body through without cracking it any further and endangering anyone standing surrounding it. Gently he laid his hands on his friend's torso and began to push him forward, his form sinking into the exposed surface of the lake at the moment it got close. All at once Luke's body was engulfed by the water, and he was swallowed whole like prey, falling down into the depths. It all happened so quickly at the moment. Luke was there, and then he wasn't. It only took an instant for him to disappear completely from their lives, literally and figuratively. Clementine closed her eyes for a moment, reflecting on how that was last time she ever see someone consider as a close friend. There was never any time to grieve the fast-paced world it lived in. So she was grateful for the quiet, reflective moments like this. Thank you for everything. Goodbye. Her fists tightened at her sides as she lifted her head to stare at the darkening sky, noting how quickly it was growing dark with the sun setting in. It would grow even colder than it was, and standing outside for far too long would grow deadly quickly. Clementine's arms wrapped around herself as she huffed out, watching her breath dissolve into the cold air. Beside her, Sarah sunk into her knees into the snowy grass near the ice, huddling in a small ball and her gaze focused on the ground. Nick stared at her for a moment before bending down, his arms open in invitation. The girl didn't hesitate, latching onto the man as tears freely escaped her. She practically melted onto him once more as they settled into her hug, bearing in the mutual pain that they both could. Clementine took a few steps back, trying not to stare. They'd known Luke so much longer, and she felt that she was intruding on a private moment. Nick's eyes screwed tightly shut as he held Sarah, clinging on to the only person of the cabin group he had left. Why did this have to happen? Sarah whimpered. The words brought painful memories of the younger Clementine's anguished crisis over her parents as walkers and Lee's death. Clementine learned a long time ago that there was no answer to that sort of question. Things didn't have a reason for happening. They just did, and they had to deal with them as they came. Mom, Dad, Lee, it didn't matter who. It was all the same in the world. Things just happened, she whispered. There was no one and nothing to blame. And she closed her eyes and ignored the sharp pricks of the tears around them. That night they all huddled around the fireplace in the main room, kindling the flames to keep it strong. Unsurprisingly, no one felt like talking much, and mostly everyone just kept to themselves in deep thought. It was complete opposite of the chatty night that they had the previous night with Sarah, leading them all in the discussion of loved ones they left behind. With a new knot added to their ropes, it just didn't seem like a good conversation topic right now. Nick and Sarah were the quietest, sitting a bit away from the fireplace as they thought it was cursed. Then again, Clementine could see why they would think of something like that. Untrue as it was, she couldn't blame them, though she wished that they would allow themselves warmth with everyone. Arvo, who had been allowed to sit near the fireplace per Mike's restlessness, was far away from Kenny as possible, his eyes wide with fear behind the glasses. The rest of the group members weren't happy campers by any means, of course. No one could think of anything to say, proving how much Luke kept everyone in good spirits. With him gone, it just felt different. I think we need to start thinking about where we're going after this, Kenny suddenly announced, his voice growing lower at the quieter of the night. Mike nodded. I think this is honestly too cold for AJ personally. If we ain't careful, he could freeze. Well, yeah, if we're not careful anywhere, he could get eaten, Jane pointed out coldly, probably earning a glare from almost everybody in the group. What? There aren't as many walkers around here in case you haven't noticed. She ain't wrong. Kids got less of a chance of beating a lurker chow out here. Fucking sucks for us, though, Troy growled, his chin in hand. Don't know where y'all be thinking of heading, but I know there ain't anything back for us the way we came from. Bonnie crossed her arms. Not even housed? I get it was run out by lurkers, but it should be empty now. Lots of supplies, food, ammo, shelter. It'd be backtracking a little, but I think it'd be a good idea still. Troy shook his head. Ain't no way Tavia ain't letting us stay. Are you frickin' stupid? Do you really think those guys are still there? Mike asked. If they're either dead or sent packing, as far as I'm concerned, it's anyone's to take now. Kenny shifted himself so he was leaning back against one of the couches, gazing down on the child of his arms. Wellington has always been our plan, so we'll stick to it, he muttered. Clementine gnawed at the bottom of her lip, gouging everyone's reaction to Kenny's plan. No one seemed too happy with how Kenny expected this world to be by law, but as if it was always they could come up with a better plan at the moment. But for now the group just listened and didn't protest, if only to keep the tone as peaceful as possible. As she kept her eyes around the room, Clementine took note of how everyone seemed to be doing. Troy and Jane were unsurprisingly calm, their empathy levels clearly too low to be affected by everyone's grief. Mike and Bonnie were exchanging a glance, and Arvo just merely stared at the fireplace. Kenny nodded to himself, prominently assuming he was convinced everyone to follow his plan, as he rocked AJ a bit in his arms. Sarah was still curled up a little ways off, silent as ever, and Nick looked different. The look on his face made Clementine uneasy. The way his eyebrows were scrunched over, revealing the wrinkles around his forehead, and shouldn't be there for a man his age, and on how high his shoulders were raised, and in stress and clear indicators of how intense he was. She was about to ask him if anything was wrong, or to at least put a hand on his shoulder, but he suddenly stood up, startling her with now quickly as he moved. "I need to say something." The tone in the voice room quietly suddenly changed as Nick's voice trembled. A solemn look painted onto his face. "There ain't getting out of this. I'm sorry. I just can't say nothing." "Well, what is it, Nick?" Sarah asked beside him, her eyes as wide as miniature moons. "Well, Sarah, actually, there's something I need to ask you to do specifically," Nick replied, his voice grave tone. "Something only you could do as the last member of the cabin group." The words felt like stones hitting Clementine's stomach. The last member? Sarah's echoed wide in confusion. "What do you mean, Nick? You're still here too?" Nick's lips curled into a mirthless smile. "I won't be here for long. Look." His fingers clutched into the collar of his shirt, pulling the fabric onto the side. Once he revealed his collarbone, gravity finally set into this situation, and Clementine just stood there for once. The look of fear she had seen before. It wasn't that he was afraid of living without Luke, but following his fate. Against his pale skin color, the deep purple and reddish colors were sinking. Small nicks at the size of the human-shaped teeth made a trail just below where his shirt covered, forming a cluster of coin-sized lumps underneath the swollen flesh. There was no denying what the marks were, and there was no escaping of reality. It needed to happen soon. "Oh God, no," Bonnie whispered, her words leaving breathlessly. "Nick, not you too." Clementine felt her heart race, the disgusting, dreadful eyes of losing someone she'd never get used to pulling into her belly. It wasn't fair. She just said goodbye to Luke, and now Nick too? She cursed herself for thinking like a child. Who was he, Troy? Of course it wasn't fair. The world was never fair now. Loss was inevitable, and practically assured. If the damn world taught her anything, it was that. "Where did you hide it? You put us in danger!" Troy yelled, his lips drawn tight for a frown, despite his words. He wasn't happy that Nick was bitten, and that was for sure. Instead of snapping the words in return, merely just stared at the ground with an anguished look, the life seemingly draining from him. "I didn't want to hide it. I just wanted to say goodbye to Luke first." His shoulders then shook as his head dropped further, the rim of his hat covering his face. Clementine couldn't hold her emotions any longer. Without warning, she leapt onto her feet and wrapped her arms around Nick, squeezing him as she thought he'd float away if she didn't hold onto it tight enough. Burying her face into his shirt, she once more held back the horrible stinging in her eyes, pricking at her irises like needles. "I'm sorry, I didn't shoot quick enough," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." "Hey, Clem, it wasn't your fault. It wasn't anyone's fault. I'm glad you two are safe." He cast a quick glance at Sarah, too, a pained smile forming on his face. "Nick," Bonnie stood up next, closing the distance between them and the hugging man as well. Sarah was next, wrapping her arms around Nick from behind and quietly sobbing into his shirt. He just stood there, three bodies pressed closely against his, before accepting the extra weight sinking into the embrace. When they all parted, Mike just walked over and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Thanks for taking care of the girls, man," he said. While Troy and Jane and Arvo were completely silent, Kenny spoke his recognition. "You did good, Vanilla Ice," he muttered, nodding in approval. Nick sucked in a shuddering breath, a slight smile on his face despite everything. Tears pooled from behind his eyes, and some escaped his own cheeks. He rubbed them with his face, and a noise escaped him. A noise that was halfway between a laugh and a sob. Bits of broken sounds broke through his lips, but he couldn't quite get them out to form into more. They all stood there, listening to the attempts of the man with one foot, the grief to speak his last words, but found himself unable to say anything comprehensible. Clementine imagined if he was trying to thank them, but she never asked to find out. "Was it you wanted me to do for you?" Sarah asked, her voice almost a whimper. Clementine followed Sarah and Nick outside to say their final goodbyes. It was obvious that Nick was requesting of the older girl, but hadn't just caught on to it just yet. When he finally told her, plain and simple, that he needed her to shoot him. Sarah's eyes stretched wider than they had been. The look of horror on her face was unbearable. I can't do that. I can't, she stuttered, breaths quickening in panic. Deep breaths. It's okay, Nick soothed, crouching down to her level. He was already looking paler than before, or perhaps it was just a trick of the eyes regardless. They didn't have too much time to waste. I know you can. I saw you shooting those bottles with Troy and Clem. Mike, you learned quickly. But why couldn't we just find medicine for you? Sarah's voice indicated that she didn't believe in her own words and was just merely grasping at the shards over the native and once of her way of thinking. After losing her father and the other members of the group, it was obvious that Sarah's view behind the rose-colored glasses had been muddied. After Nick had just shook his head, she continued, Okay, that was silly of me to say, but is there any other way? Can't we, cut it off your skin? It doesn't look that deep. The infection's already swimming through my blood. It's too late for any of that, and it wouldn't have worked unless it was a limb anyway. Then I don't know, Sarah cried, frustrated and pain, tears running down her face. I don't want you to die, Nick. I don't want to either, I'm sorry. Nick closed his eyes, thoughtfully for a moment. But it would mean the world to me if you were the one to put me out of my misery. As the last member of the cabin crew, quickly glanced over at Clementine. No offense, Clem. Clementine had almost forgotten that she was practically physically present for this, and not just to watch it through her tears, but, of course, through the lens. Nick spoke her name. She jolted backwards into awareness, giving a swift nod. It's okay. This is something between you two. I think Sarah should do it too. Clem's way better than a gun, with a gun anyway, Sarah reasoned. Nick chuckled bitterly. This will just be practice for you then. Don't worry. His target won't move either. I'll be as still as the bottles. Sarah sighed, her eyes cast downwards onto the ice. The three of them were right next to where they could put Luke, and decided that Nick would be placed into the same spot of the water after he had been shot. This way the two of them could still be together. I hate this, the older girl muttered, her fists tightening. I hate this. I hate having to say goodbye. Believe me, I know, Nick replied. This is how I felt when I lost my mom and Pete. It's the worst feeling in the world, but Sarah, you're strong. You can shoot and be a medic in your dad's place. You have many willings to help you. You'll be okay. Almost hesitantly, he ran his hand through his hair and removed the hat, eventually holding out to Sarah. It needs a wash, but I want you to have it. If you want it, that is. Sarah blinked, eyes then trailing back and forth to that hat. Nick, are you sure? Clementine had her father's hat, now Sarah had the chance to keep Nick's memory alive with her at all times. She nudged her friend, nodding in the notion, and urging her to accept it. It would provide Sarah the opportunity to heal enough to keep going. As Clementine had her parents' deaths, the older girl accepted the hat, holding it tightly between her fingers as if to break into pieces if she dropped it. Nick next reached into his pocket, taking out 2 rope pieces, heading them to her. Hold on to my rope for me, and Luke's too. I took it from his body end. Could you tie the knots for us too? Nick asked, his voice breaking. Sarah looked absolutely miserable. Of course I will. You two, you were like family. She then leaned forward and wrapped her arms around the broad man's shoulders, scrunching her eyes shut. Thank you for saving me. Before, I'll try to be strong. I know you can do it, Nick replied with a smile. Right, Clem? Once more, Clementine found herself on the ground in the tragic situation, reminding her that she was just not observing these people to interact, but she was still very much involved too. This was just as much as her loss as anyone's. She still forced a confident look as she could muster. Yeah, like you said, we'll be fine, Nick. You just rest easy. Like he was just going to sleep after a long journey, she wished him the best, wherever he'd go. Thanks. I'm glad I met you too, Clem, Nick replied, his face fading. Truth be told, I'm pretty scared to die, but I hope if there's somewhere to go afterwards, I could see my mom and Pete and Luke and everyone I lost. He rubbed the back of his neck anxiously, eyes then cast downwards, and I'll keep watch all over you if I can. Sarah squeezed him tighter. Thank you, thank you. Clementine then found herself joining their embrace, closing her eyes tightly and feeling some tears escape her. The reality of losing both Nick and Luke so suddenly slammed into her all at once, the grief catching up to her, and letting her cry for them. "You saved us. You're a hero," she murmured, and watched the smile at those words. When they finally parted after their hug, all the collectively knew it was time. Sarah raised her gun and Nick got on his knees, smiling up at despite everything. Through her sobs, the girl managed to aim her weapon correctly and took a deep breath. She whispered a goodbye and then squeezed the trigger. A single loud shot rang out and meeting its target. It was like the ending to a play. The main actor stood alone in the center stage as the curtains drew to a close, making him disappear into the ending of the story for the audience. Nick's story was over.